My name is Margaret DeVille, and this is how I discovered that my husband of 37 years had not only betrayed our marriage, but attempted to steal the life we'd built together, along with the house I'd helped pay for since 1987. The day I found them in my living room, her feet propped up on my grandmother's antique coffee table like she owned the place, something inside me shifted forever. I wasn't just heartbroken. I was furious. And that fury, combined with 40 years of business experience they knew nothing about, would save everything I held dear.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're a subscriber, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Tell us a duh.
It started on what should have been an ordinary Thursday in late September. The maple trees outside our Victorian home in Millbrook were just beginning to turn, painting the quiet residential street in shades of amber and gold. I had been in Boston for 5 days, longer than I'd been away from home in decades, helping my daughter Lila settle into her new apartment after her divorce. At 72, I thought my caretaking days were behind me, but family calls when family needs you. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was helping my daughter escape a failed marriage while my own was crumbling without my knowledge. Carl and I had lived in this house for 28 years. We'd bought it when he was 50, and I was 45, both of us finally established enough in our careers to afford something with character. The 1920s Victorian had good bones but needed everything: new plumbing, updated electrical, a complete kitchen renovation. I'd thrown myself into the project with the same intensity I brought to my work as a senior accountant at Bennett & Associates. Those early years were some of our happiest. Carl would come home from his job at the insurance company, sleeves rolled up, ready to help with whatever project I'd tackled that day. We'd work side by side, stripping wallpaper, refinishing hardwood floors, turning the neglected house into something beautiful. Every room held memories of our partnership: the kitchen where we'd cooked thousands of meals together, the living room where we'd hosted bridge club for 15 years, the master bedroom where we'd weathered illnesses and celebrated anniversaries. By the time I retired at 68, 4 years ago, the house was our masterpiece. The garden I'd cultivated bloomed with heirloom roses and peonies. The sunroom I'd added overlooked the backyard, where our grandchildren had played during countless family gatherings. The basement had been converted into Carl's workshop, where he spent hours building furniture and birdhouses with meticulous care. But something had shifted in recent months, though I'd been too trusting, or perhaps too comfortable, to see it clearly. Carl had become distant, distracted. He'd started working late more frequently, taking weekend trips to assess claims in neighboring towns. When I suggested we travel together, visit the grandchildren more often, he'd wave me off with vague excuses about workload and responsibilities. "You go ahead, Maggie," he'd say, using the nickname that had once made me smile. "I've got too much on my plate right now." I'd assumed it was pre-retirement anxiety. At 75, Carl was finally talking about stepping back from the insurance company where he'd worked for 30 years. Maybe the prospect of spending more time together was making him nervous. Maybe he was having one of those midlife crises that strike some men in their 70s, a last gasp of independence before settling into old age. I'd been patient, understanding. I'd given him space. That patience now felt like naive stupidity. The morning I was supposed to return from Boston, I'd called Carl from Lila's apartment. No answer. I'd texted that I was catching an earlier train and would be home by 3 instead of 6. No response. It wasn't unusual. Carl had never been much for phones, but something felt different this time, heavy, like the air before a storm. I'd taken the train from South Station, watching familiar Massachusetts countryside roll past the windows, thinking about dinner plans and whether Carl had remembered to water my indoor plants. Simple domestic thoughts from a woman who believed her biggest concern was whether her husband had been eating properly in her absence. The taxi dropped me at the curb at 2:47 p.m. Our house stood in the afternoon sunlight, its deep blue shutters and cream-colored siding exactly as I'd left it. The front porch, where I'd spent countless evenings reading and watching the neighborhood children play, looked undisturbed. Even the wicker furniture was arranged exactly as I'd left it. But there was a car in the driveway I didn't recognize. A red Honda Civic, maybe 10 years old, parked behind Carl's burgundy Buick. A repair person perhaps, or someone from the insurance company. Carl occasionally brought colleagues home for lunch or coffee when they were discussing complex cases. I pulled my suitcase up the front walk, fishing in my purse for my keys. The spare key was still hidden under the ceramic frog by the front steps. I'd checked automatically, a habit formed over decades of home ownership. Everything looked normal, peaceful even. I should have known that the most devastating betrayals often wear the mask of ordinary afternoons. I unlocked the front door and stepped into the foyer, breathing in the familiar scent of lemon furniture polish and the lavender sachets I kept in the hall closet. The house was quiet, but not empty. I could hear voices from the living room, low and conversational. Carl's laugh, which I recognized even after 37 years of marriage. And another laugh, a woman's laugh, light, musical, unfamiliar. I set my suitcase down by the stairs and walked toward the living room, my footsteps muffled by the Persian runner I'd chosen so carefully 12 years ago. The voices became clearer as I approached. Carl was telling a story about something that had happened at work, his tone animated in a way I hadn't heard in months. What I saw when I reached the living room doorway stopped me cold. Carl was sitting in his favorite leather armchair, the one position to catch the afternoon light streaming through the bay windows. Across from him, on our burgundy sofa, sat a woman I'd never seen before. She appeared to be in her early 60s, with silver blonde hair cut in a stylish bob and wearing a soft pink sweater that probably cost more than I spent on clothes in 6 months. Her stockinged feet were propped up on my grandmother's coffee table, the antique mahogany piece that had been in my family for 3 generations. She held a cup of coffee, my good china, I noticed with a sharp stab of indignation, and was laughing at whatever story Carl had been telling. They both looked up when I appeared in the doorway, and the easy intimacy of the moment shattered like glass hitting concrete. The woman's smile faltered slightly when she saw me, but she didn't look embarrassed or caught off guard. If anything, she looked mildly inconvenienced, like a dinner party guest interrupted by an unexpected delivery. Carl's reaction was even more telling. Not shock, not guilt, but a flash of annoyance that crossed his weathered features before he could mask it. "Margaret," he said, setting down his coffee cup with deliberate calm, "you're home early." I checked my watch, a nervous habit I'd developed over 4 decades in accounting. "It's 10 minutes to 3. I texted you that I was catching the earlier train." The woman on my sofa, my grandmother's antique coffee table still supporting her feet, smiled and extended a manicured hand toward me. "You must be Margaret. I'm Camille Lowry. Carl's told me so much about you." I didn't take her hand. I looked at Carl, waiting for an explanation that would make sense of this bizarre scene unfolding in my living room. A client meeting at home was unusual but not unprecedented. But clients didn't typically make themselves quite so comfortable, and they certainly didn't know enough about me for Carl to have told them so much. "Camille is," Carl began, then stopped, running a hand through his thinning gray hair. It was a gesture I'd seen countless times over the years when he was trying to figure out how to explain a complicated insurance claim to a frustrated customer. "I'm a friend," Camille finished smoothly, finally removing her feet from my coffee table and sitting up straighter. "Carl and I met at the community center last month. I've been going through a difficult time, a divorce, and he's been wonderfully supportive.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
I studied her more carefully. She was attractive in that carefully maintained way of women who had both time and money to invest in their appearance. Her makeup was flawless, her jewelry expensive but tasteful. The divorce explanation might account for her presence, but it didn't explain the casual intimacy I'd witnessed, or why my husband looked more animated talking to her than he had talking to me in months. "How thoughtful of you, Carl," I said, keeping my voice level. "Though I'm surprised you didn't mention you were having company today. I would have picked up something nice for lunch." Carl shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "It was last minute. Camille called this morning, and I thought, well, you were in Boston, and she needed someone to talk to." Camille nodded earnestly. "I hope you don't mind my imposing like this. Carl mentioned you were visiting your daughter, and I didn't want to be alone with my thoughts today. The divorce papers came through yesterday, and I was feeling rather emotional about it all." Her explanation was plausible, even sympathetic. A newly divorced woman seeking comfort from a friend. Carl had always been a good listener, patient with people in crisis. It was what made him successful in insurance, dealing with customers during some of the worst moments of their lives. But something felt wrong. Maybe it was the way Camille's eyes didn't quite meet mine when she spoke about being emotional. Maybe it was how Carl avoided looking directly at me at all. Or maybe it was the small details I was trained to notice after decades of auditing books and catching discrepancies. The way Camille knew exactly where to find the good china. The fact that she'd made herself comfortable enough to put her feet up. The subtle intimacy in how she said Carl's name. "I should let you two catch up," Camille said, rising gracefully from the sofa. "Carl, thank you for listening. It means more than you know." She moved toward him, and I watched in stunned silence as she leaned down and kissed his cheek. Not a polite peck, but a lingering kiss that spoke of familiarity, of countless similar moments I hadn't witnessed. Carl's face flushed slightly, and he glanced at me with what looked like defiance mixed with guilt. "I'll walk you to your car," he said, standing quickly. They moved toward the front door together, their conversation dropping to murmurs I couldn't quite catch. I remained frozen in the living room doorway, my mind struggling to process what I'd just witnessed. Through the bay window, I watched Carl walk Camille to her red Honda, his hand resting lightly on her back. They stood by her car door talking for several more minutes, their body language speaking volumes about a relationship that extended far beyond casual friendship. When Carl finally returned to the house, closing the front door behind him with unnecessary force, I was still standing exactly where he'd left me. "She seems lovely," I said carefully. Carl loosened his tie, another nervous gesture from our decades together. "She's going through a rough time. The divorce has been difficult." "How long have you known her?" "I told you we met at the community center last month." "Which community center? You've never mentioned going to any community center." A flash of irritation crossed his face. "The one on Maple Street. I've been attending their senior fitness classes. Dr. Harrison said I needed more exercise for my blood pressure." This was news to me. In 5 days away, Carl had apparently developed an exercise routine, befriended a recently divorced woman, and become intimate enough with her to host private counseling sessions in our living room while I was away. "I see," I said. "And these fitness classes, they meet at people's homes now." Carl's jaw tightened. "Margaret, don't start. I'm trying to help someone who's going through a difficult time. I thought you'd approve of that." The deflection was so smooth, so practiced, that I realized this conversation, or versions of it, had been rehearsed. Carl had been preparing for this moment, when I would eventually notice his new friendship and ask questions. "Of course I approve of helping people," I said quietly. I'm just surprised you didn't mention Camille before now. In 37 years of marriage, you've always told me about your friends. Carl walked past me toward the kitchen, effectively ending the conversation. There's leftover casserole in the refrigerator if you're hungry. I need to make some calls for work. I listened to his footsteps retreating down the hallway toward his home office, the same office where he'd handled our taxes every year, where we'd made financial decisions together, where he'd always included me in the important aspects of his life. Standing alone in my living room, surrounded by furniture we'd chosen together, and photographs documenting 37 years of shared history, I felt something fundamental shift inside me. The woman who had walked through that front door 20 minutes ago, trusting, patient, willing to give her husband the benefit of the doubt, was disappearing. In her place stood someone I barely recognized, a woman who had built a successful accounting career by noticing discrepancies, catching lies, and following paper trails to their inevitable conclusions. And Margaret DeVille had just given me my first set of numbers that didn't add up. Over the next 3 days, Carl treated me like I was losing my mind. It started small, innocent comments that made me question my own perceptions. When I mentioned that Camille had seemed very comfortable in our home, Carl frowned and said, "Comfortable? She was nervous the entire time, Margaret. I thought you of all people would have more compassion for someone going through a divorce." When I asked about the senior fitness classes he'd supposedly been attending, he sighed heavily and pulled out his phone, showing me a screenshot of the community center's website. See, Senior Strength and Mobility, Tuesdays and Thursdays at 10. I've been going for 6 weeks. I mentioned it several times, but you were so busy with your book club and garden projects, you probably weren't listening. The accusation stung because it carried just enough truth to make me doubt myself. I had been distracted lately. Lila's divorce had been consuming, and I'd been spending more time with my friends and hobbies. Had Carl mentioned fitness classes? Was it possible I'd simply not paid attention? But 6 weeks would have put his first class in mid-August, and I distinctly remembered August because we'd celebrated our 37th wedding anniversary with dinner at Romano's. Carl had been his usual self that night, attentive, affectionate, present. When had he become this distant stranger who apparently lived a secret life I knew nothing about? "I don't remember you mentioning the classes," I said carefully. Carl's expression shifted to one of patient concern, the same look he used with clients who couldn't understand their insurance policies. "Margaret, you've been very stressed lately, with Lila's situation and your mother's estate still being settled, and now you're worried about things that don't need worrying about. Maybe you should make an appointment with Dr. Peterson. Sometimes stress can affect memory." The suggestion that I needed medical evaluation for questioning my husband's new friendship hit like a physical blow. In our 37 years together, Carl had never suggested I was mentally unstable, never implied that my concerns were symptoms of illness rather than valid observations. "I'm not stressed," I said firmly. "I'm confused. Yesterday you didn't mention knowing anyone named Camille. Today you're telling me you've been attending fitness classes for 6 weeks that I somehow forgot you mentioning multiple times." Carl stood up abruptly from the kitchen table, his coffee cup clattering against the saucer. "This is exactly what I'm talking about. You're looking for problems where none exist. Camille is a friend, a woman going through a difficult time who needed someone to listen. I help her the same way I'd help any neighbor or acquaintance in crisis. But you're turning it into some kind of conspiracy." "I'm not, you are," he interrupted, his voice rising slightly. "You came home from Boston already suspicious and hostile. You barely acknowledged Camille when I introduced you, you interrogated me about where we met, and now you're suggesting I'm lying about activities I've mentioned repeatedly. This isn't like you, Margaret." The The phrase hung in the air between us. This isn't like you. Carl was rewriting not just recent events but my entire personality. According to him, I was typically understanding, typically supportive, typically trusting. The woman asking reasonable questions about her husband's mysterious new friendship was an aberration, a concerning change that required medical attention. It was masterfully done. That evening, Carl announced he was going out to dinner with some colleagues from work. He'd never been one for frequent work socializing, but when I asked which colleagues, he rattled off names I recognized. John Wilbert from claims processing, Dane Bennett from underwriting. Where are you going? I asked. That new steakhouse on Route 9. John's been wanting to try it. I almost asked if I could join them, but something in Carl's tone suggested the invitation wouldn't be welcome. Instead, I nodded and said I'd probably read in bed early. After he left, I called John Wilbert's wife, Sandra. We'd been friendly for years, often chatting at company picnics and retirement parties. Oh, hi, Margaret. Sandra sounded genuinely pleased to hear from me. How was your visit with Lila? Carl mentioned she's finally getting settled after that awful divorce. It went well, thank you. I was just wondering, is John out at dinner tonight? Carl said something about a work gathering, but I can't remember if spouses were invited. There was a brief pause. John's been home all evening, dear. He's in the garage working on that boat motor he bought at the yard sale. Are you sure Carl said John was going? My stomach dropped. Maybe I misunderstood. You know how men are with details. Sandra laughed. Don't I ever? Will give Carl my best. We should all get together soon. After hanging up, I sat in the quiet kitchen for a long time. Carl had lied directly to my face about where he was going and who he was with. When confronted with evidence of deception, he'd turned the spotlight on me, suggesting I was the one with the problem. I'd spent 4 decades as a professional accountant. I knew the difference between legitimate discrepancies and deliberate fraud. I knew how people behaved when they were hiding something, and I knew the tactics they used to deflect suspicion. Carl was exhibiting every classic sign of someone maintaining a secret life. But he was also methodically undermining my confidence in my own perceptions. Every question I asked was evidence of my suspicious nature. Every concern I raised was proof of my unstable mental state. Every time I pressed for details, I was being hostile or looking for problems. It was psychological warfare disguised as loving concern, and it was working. Despite my professional experience with fraud detection, despite my natural analytical mind, I found myself questioning whether I was overreacting. Maybe Carl really had mentioned the fitness classes. Maybe I really had been too distracted to notice. Maybe a man approaching 76 was entitled to some independent friendships without his wife's constant scrutiny. When Carl returned home at nearly 11 o'clock, he kissed my forehead and said the dinner had run long because John was having marriage problems and needed to talk. I wanted to confront him about the lie, but something held me back. If I revealed that I'd called Sandra, Carl would accuse me of spying, of being paranoid, of behaving in ways that weren't like me. He'd turn my reasonable fact-checking into evidence of my deteriorating mental state. Instead, I lay awake beside him long into the night, listening to his easy, untroubled breathing, and realized that somewhere in the past few months, my husband of 37 years had become a stranger who was systematically gaslighting me. And tomorrow, I was going to start documenting everything. The next morning, Carl left for work with a cheerful kiss on my cheek and a promise to pick up groceries on his way home. The normalcy of it, his coffee mug in the sink, his reading glasses forgotten on the counter, the familiar scent of his aftershave lingering in the hallway, made the previous evening's deception feel almost surreal. But as soon as his burgundy Buick disappeared around the corner, I reached for my phone and dialed a number I hadn't called in over a year. Cecilia Bennett, attorney at law, came the crisp, professional voice of my former colleague's daughter. Cecilia, it's Margaret DeVille. I hope I'm not calling too early. Mrs. DeVille. Her tone warmed immediately. Never too early for you. How are you? Mom mentioned she saw you at the farmer's market last month. I'd known Cecilia since she was a teenager helping her mother with bookkeeping at the law firm, where I'd done accounting work for 15 years before retiring. She'd grown into a formidable attorney, specializing in family law and divorce proceedings. Smart, thorough, and most importantly, someone who understood that numbers always told a story. I'm fine, dear, but I have a question for you. A hypothetical situation. Of course. What's on your mind? I took a deep breath, choosing my words carefully. If a woman suspected her husband was being unfaithful, what would be the first steps she should take to protect herself legally? There was a brief pause. When Cecilia spoke again, her voice had shifted to her professional tone. Mrs. DeVille, are we talking about a friend of yours, or would you prefer I treat this as a confidential consultation? The question forced me to confront what I was really doing. Until this moment, I could pretend I was just gathering information, satisfying curiosity about a hypothetical situation. But Cecilia was offering me attorney-client privilege, the protection of confidentiality, that would turn this from idle speculation into the first step of legal preparation. Confidential consultation, I said quietly. All right. First thing, don't confront him directly until you have documentation. If there's financial misconduct involved, confrontation often leads to assets being hidden or moved. Do you have access to all joint accounts and financial records? Yes, I handle most of our finances. I always have. Good. Start documenting everything: bank statements, credit card bills, unusual expenses, changes in routine, any evidence of the relationship. Keep copies somewhere he can't access them. Do you have a safety deposit box or trusted friend who could hold documents? My mind immediately went to my daughter Lila, but she was dealing with her own divorce aftermath. Then I thought of my neighbor, Archie Lowry, a retired police detective, who lived 3 houses down. Archie and his wife had been friends for years, and he'd often joked that after 30 years on the force, he could spot deception from across the street. I can arrange something, I said. Second, be careful about confronting the other woman directly. If she knows she's been discovered, she might encourage him to move assets quickly or become more secretive. Right now, if they don't know you're suspicious, they're more likely to be careless. I thought about Camille Lowry, how comfortable she'd seemed in my living room, how easily she'd explained her presence. If she and Carl thought I'd accepted their friendship story, they might continue meeting openly, giving me opportunities to gather evidence. Third, consider hiring a private investigator. I know that sounds dramatic, but if you're going to need evidence for divorce proceedings, professional documentation is invaluable. And Margaret, her voice softened slightly. I'm sorry you're going through this. I know how much you and Mr. DeVille seem to care for each other. The past tense wasn't lost on me. Thank you, dear. One more question. What if there are financial irregularities? Things that don't add up. What kind of irregularities? I hesitated. I hadn't actually found any financial problems yet, but my instincts were screaming that Carl's behavior suggested more than just an affair. Men didn't gaslight their wives and create elaborate lies about work dinners unless they were hiding something significant. I'm not sure yet. But if there were unusual withdrawals, hidden accounts, that sort of thing. Document everything immediately. Financial fraud in marriage can include hiding marital assets, secret accounts, forged signatures on documents. In Massachusetts, both spouses have rights to marital property, regardless of whose name is on accounts. If he's moving money to hide it from potential divorce proceedings, that's a serious legal issue. After ending the call, I sat in my kitchen for several minutes, processing what I'd just done. I'd officially moved from confused wife to potential divorce client. The word divorce felt foreign, almost impossible to apply to my 37-year marriage, but Cecilia's practical advice had crystallized something important. I needed information before I could make any decisions. I spent the rest of the morning doing what I did best, analyzing numbers. Our joint checking account showed normal activity for the most part, but there were several cash withdrawals over the past 2 months that seemed unusual. Carl typically used his debit card for everything. He'd often joked that he hadn't carried significant cash since the 1980s. But here were withdrawals of $200, $300, $400, amounts large enough to fund dinners, gifts, activities he didn't want appearing on statements I reviewed. The credit card bills were more revealing. Charges at restaurants I'd never been to, always for 2 people based on the amounts. A florist charge for $150 in early September, around the time I'd been in Boston helping Lila. Gas station charges in towns where Carl had no business traveling. But it was the charge at Brennan's Jewelry that made my hands shake. $1,847.99 on September 15th, the day after I'd returned from Boston and met Camille. We'd been married for 37 years. Carl hadn't bought me jewelry in a decade, and certainly nothing costing nearly $2,000. Our anniversary was in August. We'd celebrated quietly with dinner at Romano's, and he'd given me a card and flowers from the grocery store. I called Brennan's Jewelry, a small family-owned shop in downtown Millbrook. "Good morning, this is Margaret DeVille. My husband Carl made a purchase there on September 15th, and I wanted to confirm the details for our insurance records." "Oh yes, Mrs. DeVille. Mr. DeVille purchased a beautiful pearl necklace with matching earrings. The Mikimoto set from our estate collection. He mentioned it was for someone very special. Would you like me to check if the insurance appraisal is ready?" My mouth went dry. "That won't be necessary. Thank you." I hung up and stared at the credit card statement. Carl had spent nearly $2,000 on pearls for Camille Lowry the day after I'd met her. The day after she'd sat in my living room with her feet on my grandmother's coffee table, playing the role of vulnerable divorcee in need of emotional support. This wasn't a casual friendship. This wasn't even a simple affair. Carl and Camille had been playing me for a fool, and they'd been planning it carefully enough to have their story ready when I accidentally came home early and discovered them together. I picked up my phone and called Archie Lowry. "Margaret, good to hear from you. How's retirement treating you?" "Very well, Archie. I wonder if I could ask a favor. I need someone I trust to hold some important documents for me. Personal financial records that I'd prefer to keep somewhere safe." There was a pause. Archie had been a detective for 3 decades. He knew the sound of someone preparing for trouble. "Of course, Margaret. Would you like to bring them over now, or should I come to you?" "I'll come to you. And Archie, I might need some advice about investigating things. From someone with your experience. Whatever you need, dear. Come on over." As I gathered the financial documents I'd been reviewing, I felt something I hadn't experienced since I was 20 years old and starting my first job in accounting: the thrill of the hunt. Carl thought he was dealing with a trusting, naive wife who could be manipulated with gaslighting and lies. He had no idea he was actually dealing with a woman who'd built a career on catching people who thought they were too clever to get caught. And I was just getting started. Archie Lowry's den felt like stepping back into an active police station. Despite being retired for 8 years, he'd kept his investigative instincts sharp, and his home office still looked like a command center. Maps, filing cabinets, and a corkboard covered with what looked like ongoing projects filled the wood-paneled room. "Sit down, Margaret," he said, gesturing to a leather chair across from his desk. "Tell me what's really going on." I spread the financial documents across his desk, bank statements, credit card bills, the receipt information from Brennan's jewelry. "My husband is having an affair, and I think it's more complicated than just infidelity." Archie studied the papers with the methodical attention I remembered from when he'd investigated a break-in at our accounting firm years ago. His weathered hands moved from document to document, his gray eyes catching details I might have missed. "Carl's always been a creature of habit," he said finally. "In 20 years of being neighbors, I've watched him take the same route to work, eat lunch at the same 3 places, buy gas at the same station. These charges," he tapped the credit card statement, "this isn't habit. This is deliberate pattern creation." "What do you mean?" "Look at the dates and locations. Every Tuesday and Thursday, the days he claims to be at fitness classes, there are charges at the Pine Valley Cafe. But never on the same Tuesday 2 weeks in a row. He's rotating locations, probably thinking it makes him harder to track. Amateur mistake." Archie pulled out a yellow legal pad and began sketching what looked like a timeline. "The jewelry purchase is interesting timing too. Day after you met her, like he was rewarding her for a successful performance." The clinical way he analyzed Carl's deception was both comforting and heartbreaking. "This was my marriage we were dissecting. 37 years reduced to patterns of suspicious behavior on financial statements. What would you do if you were still investigating this professionally?" I asked. "First I'd establish their pattern, where they meet, when, how often. Then I'd look for financial irregularities, beyond what you've found. In my experience, men who lie about affairs usually lie about money too. And Margaret," he looked up from his notes, "I'd be very careful about confronting either of them until you have the complete picture. Carl's already started gaslighting me, making me feel like I'm imagining things or being paranoid." Archie's expression darkened. "Classic deflection technique. Makes me think there's more here than simple adultery. You don't gaslight someone over casual cheating, you gaslight them when you're hiding something that could destroy you if discovered." Over the next 2 weeks, I became a woman I barely recognized. During the day, while Carl was at work, I transformed into a meticulous investigator. I photographed documents before returning them to their exact positions. I noted mileage on Carl's car each morning and evening. I called restaurants where suspicious charges had appeared, claiming to be confirming reservations for insurance purposes. The picture that emerged was staggering in its deception. Carl and Camille had been meeting regularly for nearly 4 months, not the casual month-long friendship he'd claimed. They had standing reservations at 3 different restaurants on a rotating schedule. The hostess at Pine Valley Cafe even knew them by name. The lovely couple who always requests table 12 by the window. But it was what I discovered in Carl's home office that changed everything. I'd always handled our taxes and major financial decisions, but Carl managed day-to-day banking and investments. I'd trusted him completely, rarely questioning his judgment about portfolio changes or account transfers. That trust now seemed criminally naive. Hidden in a folder marked Insurance Reviews 2023, I found statements for 3 accounts I'd never seen before. 2 savings accounts and 1 money market account, all opened within the past 6 months, all in Carl's name only. The combined balance was $127,000. Our joint savings account, which should have contained nearly $200,000 from my retirement fund, and our shared investments, now held less than $80,000. Carl had systematically moved $120,000 of our shared assets into accounts I couldn't access, leaving me with barely enough to cover 6 months of household expenses if something happened to him or our marriage. I photographed every statement, every transfer record, every piece of evidence that Carl had been stealing from our joint financial future while pretending to be a loving, if distracted, husband. That evening, as Carl kissed my forehead and announced he was going to help Camille move some furniture, I smiled and told him to drive safely. After he left, I called Cecilia Bennett. "I need to hire that private investigator you mentioned," I said without preamble. "And I need to understand my legal options regarding financial fraud in marriage." "What did you find, Margaret?" "My husband has hidden $127,000 in secret accounts while carrying on an affair. And based on their behavior, I think they're planning something bigger than just stealing my retirement money." There was a long pause. "Can you be in my office tomorrow morning at 9? I'll be there." As I hung up, I looked around the living room where I'd found Carl and Camille that first afternoon. The room looked exactly the same, but everything had changed. I was no longer the trusting wife who could be manipulated with lies and gaslighting. I was a woman with evidence, allies, and a plan, and Carl DeVille had no idea what was coming. The private investigator Cecilia recommended was a woman named Dana Wilbert, a former FBI agent who now ran her own agency specializing in matrimonial investigations. Her office was sparse and professional, decorated only with her credentials and a single photograph of what appeared to be her family. "Mrs. DeVille," she said, reviewing the file I'd brought. "Based on what you've documented here, we're looking at a sophisticated operation. Your husband isn't just having an affair, he's executing a long-term financial plan." She spread Carl's secret account statements across her desk, pointing to the transfer dates. "Look at this pattern. He's been moving money systematically since March, but the amounts increased significantly in August. Right around your wedding anniversary." The timing sent a chill through me. While I'd been celebrating 37 years of marriage at Romano's, Carl had apparently been accelerating his plans to steal our shared assets. "What changed in August?" Dana asked. I thought back to our anniversary dinner, trying to remember any unusual behavior. Carl had seemed normal that night, attentive, even romantic. We'd talked about travel plans for the fall, maybe visiting Lila for Thanksgiving. He'd mentioned wanting to update our wills, suggesting we were finally at an age where estate planning made sense. "He talked about updating our wills," I said slowly. "Said we should make sure everything was in order for our children's inheritance." Dana's expression sharpened. "Did you update them?" "We made an appointment with our attorney for September, but Carl canceled it. Said something came up at work. He suggested we postpone until after the holidays." "Mrs. DeVille, I need to ask you something important. Does your husband have access to your retirement accounts? Can he make changes without your signature?" My stomach dropped. "He has power of attorney for financial decisions. We set it up years ago when I had surgery and couldn't handle paperwork for a few weeks. I never changed it back." Dana was already reaching for her phone. "We need to contact your retirement plan administrator immediately. And your attorney needs to revoke that power of attorney today." The next 3 hours were a blur of phone calls and emergency meetings. What we discovered made Carl's $127,000 theft look like petty theft in comparison. Using his power of attorney, Carl had submitted paperwork to begin early withdrawal procedures on my retirement accounts, nearly $400,000 that represented my entire working career. The requests were still being processed, delayed only by bureaucratic procedures that required 30-day waiting periods for large withdrawals. He'd also contacted our insurance company about cashing in our life insurance policies, claiming we wanted to use the money for dream retirement travel. Another $85,000 that would have disappeared into accounts I couldn't access. In total, Carl had been positioning himself to steal over $600,000 of our shared assets, while maintaining the fiction that he was simply a devoted husband going through a late-life crisis. But Dana's investigation revealed something even more disturbing. "I followed them yesterday," she said, sliding a folder of photographs across the desk. "They didn't go to dinner, they went to Cromwell Real Estate." The photos showed Carl and Camille entering and leaving a real estate office 40 minutes away in the next town. They looked comfortable, familiar with the location, like this wasn't their first visit. I called the office this morning, pretending to be interested in properties they specialize in. Turns out they handle vacation home sales and property management. Specifically, they've been working with a couple looking to purchase a retirement property in Florida. My hands trembled as I processed this information. They're planning to leave, together. It gets worse. I managed to speak with the real estate agent, lovely woman named Patricia, who was very chatty about her clients. According to her, Mr. and Mrs. DeVilles have been working with her for 6 weeks. They're looking at condominiums in Sarasota, cash purchases in the $300,000 range. The room seemed to spin around me. Carl hadn't just been stealing our money, he'd been planning to disappear with Camille, using our entire life savings to fund their new life together. The power of attorney that was supposed to protect me if I became incapacitated had become the weapon he was using to destroy me financially. "There's more," Dana continued gently. "I ran a background check on Camille Lowry. Her divorce was finalized 8 months ago, not recently like she claimed. She received a settlement of nearly $200,000, which she spent within 4 months. Based on her credit report, she's deeply in debt and facing foreclosure on her current home." The pieces clicked into place, with horrifying clarity. Camille hadn't been a vulnerable woman seeking comfort during a difficult divorce. She'd been a financially desperate woman who'd targeted my husband, recognizing him as a man with access to substantial assets and the authority to move them without his wife's knowledge. "They've been planning this since at least March," I said quietly. "The whole thing, the affair, the financial theft, the fake story about meeting at fitness classes. They targeted our marriage specifically because of my retirement money and Carl's financial power of attorney." Dana nodded grimly. "I've seen this before, Mrs. DeVille. It's called a sweetheart scam, but usually it targets widows or divorced women. This version, targeting a married man with financial authority over joint assets, is more sophisticated and far more devastating." I thought about Camille sitting in my living room, feet on my grandmother's coffee table, playing the role of the sad divorcee, while she and Carl planned to steal everything I'd worked for over 4 decades. "What do we do now?" I asked. Dana's smile was cold and professional. "Now we stop them. And Mrs. DeVille? They have no idea you know any of this. That gives us a significant advantage." As I left Dana's office, I felt a strange mixture of devastation and determination. Carl and Camille thought they were dealing with a naive, trusting wife who could be easily manipulated and robbed. They were about to discover they'd chosen the wrong woman to swindle. The next week, Carl became increasingly agitated, though he tried to hide it behind his usual veneer of concerned husband. I watched him carefully, noting the small tells I'd learned to recognize over 37 years of marriage, the way he drummed his fingers when worried, how he checked his phone obsessively when he thought I wasn't looking, the forced casualness of his voice when he announced his evening plans. "I'm helping Camille again tonight," he said. Thursday morning. Not quite meeting my eyes over his coffee cup. She's having trouble with some legal documents from her divorce. Needs someone to review the paperwork. I nodded sympathetically, buttering my toast with deliberate calm. That's kind of you. Divorce paperwork can be so confusing. Carl's relief at my easy acceptance was almost palpable. He kissed my forehead before leaving, whistling slightly as he gathered his keys and briefcase. He had no idea that Dana Wilbert would be following him, or that I'd already confirmed with Patricia at Cromwell Real Estate that Mr. and Mrs. DeVille had an appointment to view oceanfront condominiums via virtual tour that evening. After Carl left, I called Cecilia with an update on the revoked power of attorney and frozen retirement accounts. He doesn't know yet, she said. The paperwork won't reach his desk for another few days. But Margaret, be prepared. When he discovers what you've done, he's going to panic. People doing what your husband is doing don't react well to having their plans disrupted. Her warning proved prophetic. That evening Carl returned home 3 hours later than expected, his face flushed and his usually neat appearance disheveled. He'd been drinking, not heavily, but enough that I could smell whiskey on his breath when he kissed my cheek. "How did things go with Camille?" I asked, from my reading chair, not looking up from my book. "Fine," he said curtly. "Just fine," but it obviously hadn't been fine. Carl disappeared into his office, and I could hear him making phone calls, his voice low but urgent. At one point, I heard him say clearly, "There has to be some mistake. I submitted that paperwork weeks ago." The retirement account withdrawal had been denied. Over the weekend, Carl's behavior became increasingly erratic. He snapped at me over trivial things, the way I'd arranged the mail, my choice of television programs, even my decision to water the garden in the morning instead of evening. Each outburst was followed by exaggerated apologies and explanations about work stress, but I recognized the signs of a man whose carefully constructed plans were falling apart. Sunday afternoon, while Carl was supposedly at the hardware store, Dana called with her surveillance report. "They're getting desperate," she said. Friday night they didn't go to the real estate office. They went to a bar downtown and had what looked like a very heated argument. Camille appeared to be crying at one point. Yesterday they met at the bank where Carl tried to cash in those life insurance policies we blocked. What happened? Bank manager told them there were processing issues, and they'd need to return with additional documentation. Carl got agitated, demanded to speak to a supervisor. Camille kept checking her phone like she was expecting bad news. The bad news, I knew, was probably related to her impending foreclosure. According to Dana's research, Camille had less than 2 weeks before losing her house. The timeline explained their increasingly frantic behavior. They needed to execute their plan quickly, before their window of opportunity closed. Monday morning brought the confrontation I'd been dreading. Carl stormed into the kitchen at 6:30 a.m., clutching a letter from the retirement plan administrator. His face was red with fury, all pretense of the concerned husband abandoned. "What the hell is this, Margaret?" he demanded, waving the letter in my face. "They're saying my power of attorney has been revoked. They're saying you've placed restrictions on the accounts." I set down my coffee cup with steady hands, drawing on 40 years of experience dealing with angry clients who'd been caught manipulating numbers. I decided it was time to take more direct control of my own financial affairs. At my age, it seems prudent. Prudent? Carl's voice cracked slightly. "We've had this arrangement for years. Why would you suddenly change it without discussing it with me? The same reason you opened 3 secret bank accounts without discussing it with me," I said quietly, the color drained from Carl's face. For a moment, he looked exactly like the clients I'd confronted over the years when presented with evidence of embezzlement, shocked, trapped, calculating how much I actually knew. I don't know what you're talking about, he said finally. Carl, I've been handling finances professionally for 4 decades. Did you really think I wouldn't notice $127,000 disappearing from our joint assets? He stared at me for a long moment, and I could see him weighing his options. Deny everything and hope I was bluffing. Admit to some lesser version of the truth. Attack my credibility the way he'd been doing for weeks. He chose attack. You've lost your mind, he said, his voice rising. You're paranoid, suspicious, seeing conspiracies where none exist. Maybe that's what happens when women your age spend too much time alone imagining problems. But this time, his gaslighting tactics felt like water off a duck's back. I had documentation, professional allies, and most importantly, I knew the full scope of his deception. Pack a bag, Carl, I said calmly. I think you should stay somewhere else while we sort this out. This is my house too, he snarled. Actually, I said, standing to refill my coffee cup, you might want to check the deed on that. Carl's face went through a series of expressions as my words sank in: confusion, disbelief, then a dawning horror that told me he'd never actually verified the legal ownership of our home. After 37 years of marriage, he'd simply assumed that because he'd handled the mortgage payments and property taxes, the house was his. What do you mean, check the deed? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I opened the kitchen drawer, where I'd always kept our important household documents, and pulled out a folder I'd prepared the night before. I mean that when we bought this house in 1995, we structured the ownership as joint tenants with rights of survivorship. Both our names are on the deed, Carl. Equal ownership, regardless of who paid the mortgage. I slid a copy of the deed across the kitchen table. His hands shook slightly as he picked it up, scanning the legal language that clearly showed both Carl James DeVille and Margaret Rose DeVille as equal owners. This doesn't mean anything, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. I've made every mortgage payment for 28 years. I've paid for every repair, every improvement, with money from our joint accounts, I interrupted smoothly. Money that included my salary, my contributions, my retirement funds that you've been systematically stealing. Carl's face flushed red again. I haven't stolen anything. Those accounts are for our future, our retirement. Our retirement. I laughed, and the sound surprised both of us with its bitter edge. Carl, I know about Florida. I know about the condominiums in Sarasota. I know about Cromwell Real Estate, and your appointments with Patricia. I know about the $300,000 cash purchase you and Camille have been planning. The kitchen fell completely silent, except for the ticking of the antique clock on the wall, a wedding gift from my parents 37 years ago. Carl stared at me, as if I'd transformed into someone he'd never seen before. How do you? He stopped himself, realizing that finishing the question would be an admission of guilt. How do I know? I smiled, and for the first time in weeks it felt genuine. Because unlike you, Carl, I'm actually good at investigating financial irregularities. It's what I did professionally for 40 years. I pulled out Dana's surveillance photos, Carl and Camille entering the real estate office, sitting at restaurant tables, walking together through downtown Millbrook like a couple planning their future. His face went ashen as he recognized himself in image after image. You've been having me followed, he said, his voice hollow. I've been protecting myself, I corrected, the same way I'd protect any client who was being defrauded by someone they trusted. Carl slumped into the kitchen chair across from me, suddenly looking every one of his 75 years. Margaret, you don't understand. It's not what it looks like. It's exactly what it looks like. You and Camille Lowry, who isn't recently divorced, by the way, but has been single for 8 months and is facing foreclosure, have been planning to steal our life savings and disappear to Florida together. I pulled out the final piece of documentation I'd prepared, bank records showing Camille's financial situation, her debt, her desperate need for the money Carl had been promising her. She targeted you, Carl, a financially stable married man with power of attorney over significant assets. This wasn't some romantic love affair. It was a criminal conspiracy, and you were both the accomplice and the mark. For a moment I thought he might cry. His shoulders sagged, and he buried his face in his hands. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. Camille said we could work it out quietly, that you'd be reasonable about the divorce settlement. Reasonable. My voice rose despite my efforts to stay calm. You call stealing $600,000 of our joint assets, and abandoning me with nothing reasonable. Carl looked up, his eyes red-rimmed. You would have been fine. You have your pension, your social security. I would have been fine. I stood up, my chair scraping against the kitchen floor. Carl, you were planning to leave me at 72 years old, with barely enough money to maintain this house for 6 months. After 37 years of marriage, after building a life together, after trusting you with everything I had. The enormity of his betrayal seemed to hit him then, not the infidelity, that was just personal, but the systematic theft, the calculated cruelty of planning to leave me financially destroyed, while he started a new life with a woman who'd manipulated him into committing crimes. What do you want? He asked quietly. I want you out of this house tonight. I want you to close those secret accounts, and return every penny to our joint assets. I want you to end whatever fantasy you've been living with Camille, and face the reality of what you've done. And if I don't, I smiled again, and this time there was steel in it. Then tomorrow morning, Cecilia Bennett files both divorce papers citing financial fraud and a criminal complaint for elder abuse and theft. Dana Wilbert's investigation gets turned over to the district attorney's office, and instead of working this out privately, you get to explain to a judge and a jury why a 75-year-old man thought it was acceptable to steal his wife's retirement money to fund his girlfriend's gambling debts. Carl's face went white. Gambling debts? Oh, Carl. I shook my head sadly. You really don't know anything about the woman you were willing to destroy our marriage for, do you? As understanding dawned on his face, the recognition that he'd been as much a victim as a perpetrator, I felt something I hadn't expected: pity. But pity wasn't going to save him from the consequences of his choices. Pack a bag, I repeated. You have until tonight to decide whether we handle this privately or publicly. Carl left that afternoon, with a single suitcase, and the look of a man who'd finally understood the magnitude of his mistakes. He didn't argue, didn't make threats, didn't try any more gaslighting tactics. He simply packed his clothes, and walked out of the house we'd shared for 28 years. But I knew this wasn't over. Men like Carl, and women like Camille, don't surrender easily when hundreds of thousands of dollars are at stake. The showdown came the next evening. I was in my garden, deadheading the last roses of the season, when I heard a car door slam in my driveway. Through the hedge, I could see Camille's red Honda Civic. She'd come alone. I took my time finishing with the roses, then walked calmly to the front door where she was waiting on my porch. She looked different than she had that first day. Desperate now. Her careful composure cracked around the edges. "Margaret," she said, attempting a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "We need to talk." "I don't believe we do," I replied, not inviting her in. "Carl told me about your misunderstanding about our friendship. I think there's been a terrible mistake." I almost admired her audacity. Even caught red-handed, she was still trying to manipulate the situation. "The only mistake, Camille, was thinking I was too old and trusting to figure out what you were doing." Her facade finally cracked. "You don't understand. I need that money. The house, the debts, I'm losing everything. You already lost everything when you decided to commit fraud against me." "It wasn't fraud," she snapped. Carl wanted to help me. He chose to move that money. He chose to plan a future with me. He chose to steal from his wife using power of attorney he obtained under false pretenses. That's textbook elder financial abuse, and you were his accomplice. Camille's desperation became palpable. Look, we can work something out. Carl doesn't have to know. You could loan me enough to save my house, and I'll disappear. I'll end things with Carl, move away. You can have your husband back. The offer revealed how completely she misunderstood the situation. This was never about winning Carl back or saving my marriage. This was about justice. Camille, in 3 hours, you have an appointment at Cecilia Bennett's law office. Carl will be there too. You're going to sign documents returning every penny you helped steal, and you're going to provide a full confession of your role in this scheme. And if I don't, then tomorrow morning my attorney files criminal charges. Dana Wilbert turns over her investigation to the police. And instead of quietly disappearing, you get to explain to a prosecutor why a 62-year-old woman thought it was acceptable to manipulate a married man into stealing his wife's life savings. Camille stared at me for a long moment, perhaps finally recognizing that the grandmother she'd dismissed as an easy mark was actually a woman who'd spent 40 years professionally destroying people who thought they were too clever to get caught. "You're destroying his life," she said. Finally. "No, Camille. You both did that when you decided mine was worth sacrificing for your greed." At 7 p.m. sharp, both Carl and Camille sat in Cecilia's conference room, signing documents that would restore my financial security and end their criminal conspiracy. It was over. The paperwork was finalized on a crisp October morning, exactly 6 weeks after I'd first found Camille Lowry sitting in my living room with her feet on my grandmother's coffee table. Carl had returned every stolen dollar, closed the secret accounts, and signed divorce papers that left me with the house, my full retirement funds, and half of our remaining joint assets. Camille had vanished from Millbrook entirely. According to Dana's final report, she'd moved to Arizona, presumably to start over somewhere her reputation for targeting vulnerable seniors hadn't preceded her. The foreclosure on her house had proceeded as scheduled, and she'd left town owing thousands in unpaid debts. Carl had taken an apartment across town, near the insurance office where he still worked. We'd seen each other only once since that final confrontation in Cecilia's office, an awkward encounter at the grocery store where he'd looked older, diminished, like a man finally facing the consequences of decades of poor choices. "Margaret," he'd said quietly, stopping his cart near the produce section, "I want you to know, I never meant for it to go so far." "I know," I'd replied, "and I meant it." Carl wasn't evil, just weak. Weak enough to be manipulated by a desperate woman, weak enough to rationalize theft as love, weak enough to gaslight his wife rather than face his own guilt. Will you be all right?" he'd asked. I'd looked at him, this man I'd shared 37 years with, who'd helped me paint our first kitchen and held my hand through my mother's funeral, and felt nothing but a profound sadness for what we'd both lost. "I'll be fine, Carl. I hope you will be too." Now, standing in my kitchen on this October morning, I realized how true those words had been. I was more than fine. I was free. The house felt different without the undercurrent of deception that had poisoned it for months. I'd rearranged the furniture, changed the locks, and planted new bulbs in the garden that would bloom next spring. The master bedroom was mine alone now, decorated exactly how I'd always wanted it, but had compromised away over decades of marriage. My phone rang, interrupting my morning coffee ritual. It was Lila, calling from Boston. "Mom, how are you doing?" Doing. Really well, sweetheart. Better than I've been in years, honestly. I still can't believe Dad did that to you. All those years we thought he was just this steady, reliable guy. People aren't always who we think they are. But sometimes that works in our favor too. After hanging up, I walked out to my back patio, coffee in hand, and surveyed the garden I'd tended for 28 years. The roses were dormant now, preparing for winter, but I could already envision next year's plantings. Maybe a vegetable garden where Carl's workshop supplies used to be stored. Maybe some fruit trees along the back fence. For the first time in months, I was making plans that were entirely my own. The phone rang again. Archie Lowry, my neighbor and the man whose investigative expertise had helped save my future. Margaret, I'm calling with good news. That recommendation letter I wrote for you worked. The nonprofit wants to interview you next week. The Millbrook Senior Advocacy Center had offered me a volunteer position helping elderly residents protect themselves from financial scams. My experience with Carl and Camille, combined with my accounting background, apparently made me uniquely qualified to help other seniors avoid the trap I'd nearly fallen into. They want to start a program called Financial Guardian Angels, Archie continued. Volunteers, who can recognize the warning signs of elder financial abuse and help victims document evidence for law enforcement. I smiled, feeling a sense of purpose I hadn't experienced since retirement. When do I start? 3 months later, I stood before a group of 20 seniors at the Millbrook Community Center, sharing my story for the first time publicly. The faces looking back at me were a mixture of concern, recognition, and determination, people who understood that financial predators didn't discriminate by age or intelligence. The most important thing to remember, I said, concluding my presentation about warning signs of elder financial abuse, is that you're never too old to fight back, and you're never too trusting to learn how to protect yourself. After the meeting, a woman in her 80s approached me with tears in her eyes. My nephew has been pressuring me to sign over power of attorney, she whispered. After hearing your story, I know I need help. This was why I'd agreed to share the most painful chapter of my life. Every senior I helped protect was validation that my experience with Carl and Camille had served a greater purpose. The drive home took me past the insurance office where Carl still worked. His burgundy Buick wasn't in the parking lot, according to neighborhood gossip. He'd finally taken early retirement and moved to a senior community in Florida. Not Sarasota, thankfully, but somewhere he could start over without the daily reminder of his failures. I pulled into my driveway as the sun was setting, painting my Victorian house in shades of gold and amber. The garden was beginning to show signs of spring, crocuses pushing through the soil, buds forming on the maple trees. Everything was preparing for renewal. Inside, my kitchen table was covered with materials for tomorrow's workshop on financial document protection. My calendar was full of speaking engagements, volunteer commitments, and coffee dates with the new friends I'd made through the advocacy center. At 72, I had discovered that losing everything I thought I knew about my life had actually freed me to become someone stronger, wiser, and more purposeful than I'd ever imagined possible. Carl and Camille had tried to steal my future. Instead, they'd given me a better one. The doorbell rang on a sunny Saturday morning in September, exactly 1 year after I'd first encountered Camille Lowry in my living room. I opened the door to find a young woman in her 30s, holding a small bouquet of flowers and looking nervous. Mrs. DeVille, I'm Sarah Chen from the district attorney's office. I wanted to thank you personally. I invited her in, curious about this unexpected visit. Sarah settled into the same chair where Camille had once sat so confidently, but her presence felt entirely different, respectful, grateful, honest. Your case became the foundation for a major investigation, she explained. We discovered that Camille Lowry had been running similar scams across 3 states. Your documentation and Dana Wilbert's investigation helped us build cases that protected dozens of other seniors. She handed me a folder containing newspaper clippings about the prosecutions. Camille had been sentenced to 5 years in federal prison for elder financial abuse. Several other victims had come forward once the story became public, and the total amount of theft had exceeded $2 million. There's something else, Sarah continued. The state legislature is considering new laws requiring additional safeguards for power of attorney documents. They're calling it the Margaret DeVille Protection Act. I sat quietly, absorbing the magnitude of what had grown from my decision to fight back rather than accept victimization. One woman's refusal to be destroyed by betrayal had potentially protected countless others from similar fates. After Sarah left, I walked through my house, truly my house now, and marveled at how completely my life had transformed. The Financial Guardian Angels program had expanded to 12 states. I'd been invited to speak at conferences, consulted on legislation, and helped establish protocols that banks and financial institutions now use to identify potential elder abuse. The phone rang, interrupting my reflections. It was Lila, calling with news that she was engaged to a wonderful man who appreciated her strength and independence. I learned from watching you, Mom, she said, how to stand up for myself, how to recognize my own worth. As I hung up, I realized that Carl and Camille's betrayal, which had felt like the end of everything, had actually been the beginning of the most meaningful chapter of my life. Sometimes the worst thing that happens to you becomes the best thing you ever did for others.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.